Hello guys, welcome back to my channel. The story of the Crips and the Bloods is often told with a simple, almost mythic narrative, blue versus red, good versus evil, depending on who you ask. But the real story is far more complex and far more tragic. It's a story born not in a vacuum of random violence, but in the crucible of 1960 seconds. Los Angeles. To understand the gangs, you first have to understand the world that created them. The civil rights movement had crested, but for many young black people in Los Angeles, its promises felt hollow. Hope was giving way to frustration. Powerful community organizations like the Black Panthers, which once offered structure, protection, and a political voice, were being systematically dismantled by government programs like COINTELPRO. Police repression was rampant. At the same time, poverty, unemployment, and segregated housing choked off opportunity for the youth of South Central. The safety nets were gone. When the organizations that protected the community were crushed, something else was bound to rise up and fill the void. That something initially was the Crips. Formed in the late 1960s, a young man named Raymond Washington, inspired by the organizing style of the Black Panthers, envisioned a neighborhood alliance. This wasn't originally about drugs. It was about protection, social unity, and carving out an identity in a city that had forgotten them. The name's origin is debated. Some say it came from Cribs, a reference to the young age of its members. Others point to members carrying canes for style, earning them the name Cripples, which was shortened to Crips. The famous acronym Community Revolution in Progress was likely a later invention. The early purpose was simple: protect your neighborhood from outsiders. But the Crips grew with ferocious speed. They began absorbing smaller neighborhood groups, sometimes through force, sometimes through intimidation. This aggressive expansion created a problem. It fragmented the organization, leading to internal conflicts between different Crip sets that became just as deadly as any external rivalry. More importantly, it created a wave of fear that would have a massive unintended consequence. The Bloods did not exist before the Crips. They were a reaction. Across Los Angeles, smaller gangs and neighborhood groups found themselves under constant threat from the rapidly expanding Crip network. To survive, they had to unite. One of the most prominent groups to lead this charge was the Peru Street Boys from Compton. They, along with other sets, banded together to form a new alliance. They called themselves the Bloods, a name symbolizing a bond deeper than friendship, a brotherhood, where blood is thicker than water. This wasn't a master plan. It was an act of collective self-defense against what they saw as an existential threat. So how did this defensive pact turn into one of the most infamous rivalries in American history? It wasn't inevitable. The conflict was fueled by a deadly cycle. The Crips continued their territorial expansion, and the newly formed Bloods pushed back. An attack from one side would trigger a retaliation from the other, each act of revenge more severe than the last. Policing strategies at the time often made things worse, treating the conflict as a war to be contained rather than a social problem to be mediated. By the mid-1970s, the battle lines were drawn. The colors red and blue became flags in a street-level civil war, and staying neutral was no longer an option. It's crucial to remember this wasn't a war directed by generals. It was fought neighborhood by neighborhood, block by block. The territories they controlled became deeply entrenched. The Crips dominated large swaths of South Central, Compton, Inglewood, and Long Beach. The Bloods established strongholds in their own parts of Compton, Inglewood, and Watts. Over the decades, as members were incarcerated, this rivalry didn't stay in Los Angeles. It spread through the U.S. prison system, and from there to other cities across the country and even to other parts of the world, often through cultural influence rather than any central command. Within these territories, a strict set of unwritten laws emerged. These street codes replaced the social structures that had disappeared. At their core were a few key beliefs: absolute loyalty to your neighborhood or set, earning respect, and retaliating fiercely against any sign of disrespect. And above all, silence when dealing with the police, the code of no snitching. To gain status, you had to put in work, proving your loyalty through action. Betrayal wasn't just punished individually. It could bring disaster upon your entire family. These codes provided a sense of order and belonging, but they also created a trap, locking members into a cycle of violence with no easy way out. This rivalry developed its own distinct culture, visible to anyone who knew what to look for. The dress code was the most obvious sign. Crips famously adopted the color blue, often wearing blue bandanas and tilting their hats to the right. To show disrespect to their rivals, they'd often avoid using the letter B in their writing, replacing it with a C. Conversely, the Bloods claimed the color red, wore red bandanas, and often tilted their hats to the left. They would replace the letter C with a B as a sign of disrespect to Crips, but these rules were never universal. They varied widely from set to set and changed constantly over time, but the culture went deeper than just colors. It had its own language, with unique hand signs to represent sets and alliances. There were distinct walk styles. Slang like "cuz" for a fellow Crip or "blood" for a fellow Blood became part of the vernacular. This street culture would eventually bleed into the mainstream, heavily influencing West Coast hip-hop. Artists with known affiliations, like Snoop Dogg for the Crips and The Game for the Bloods, brought the imagery, language, and style of the rivalry to a global audience. Hip-hop made the red and blue iconic, but in doing so, it often glamorized the conflict, detaching the symbols from the brutal reality they represented on the streets, and that reality was brutal. The violence reached its terrifying peak in the 1980s and 90s, an era defined by two things: the crack cocaine epidemic and the flood of powerful firearms into inner-city communities. The drug trade turned neighborhood protection into a deadly business enterprise, with territories now worth killing for. The consequences were catastrophic. Tens of thousands of lives, most of them young black men, were lost. Mass incarceration exploded, tearing fathers, sons, and brothers from their families and creating entire prison generations. The constant violence and fear destabilized neighborhoods, leaving deep, lasting trauma. This raises a critical question: in all this destruction, who actually benefited? It certainly wasn't the communities, which were devastated by the loss of life and trapped in cycles of poverty. The real beneficiaries were external forces that profited from the chaos. The prison industrial complex was a huge winner. The gang wars were used to justify bigger policing budgets, tougher sentencing laws, and the expansion of private prisons, all of which became multi-billion-dollar industries. The drug and arms networks also profited immensely. The gangs weren't manufacturing the drugs or the guns. External suppliers flooded their communities with both and reaped the financial rewards. Even the media and entertainment industries cashed in. Gang imagery sold records, movie tickets, and fashion lines, turning real-life tragedy into a marketable, profitable aesthetic. And finally, real estate and gentrification interests benefited. Years of violence drove down property values, allowing developers to acquire land cheaply. Once the areas were deemed cleaned up, often through aggressive policing that displaced residents, gentrification followed, pushing out the very communities that had endured the worst of the conflict. In the end, the gangs became unwitting tools in larger economic systems that exploited their struggle for profit. So when we look back at the Crips and the Bloods, what do we see? We see groups that began as desperate attempts at survival in the face of state neglect and repression. We see how they mutated into a self-perpetuating cycle of violence, fueled by poverty and exploited by outside interests. They were born from abandonment and were ultimately consumed by the very systems that created the conditions for their existence in the first place. Understanding their story isn't about glorifying violence or choosing a side. It's a sobering lesson in how a society, through neglect and exclusion, can create the very monsters it then fears. It shows us that when community is destroyed, something else, no matter how dangerous, will always rise to take its place. Thanks for watching. If you found this deep dive insightful, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more content that goes beyond the headlines.